It seems to me that if the Catholic worker arouses the conscience by a constant portrayal of man's needs, the constant failure of government, the constant failure of any but this taking upon oneself, even though it doesn't bring the satisfaction of any immediate accomplishment.
This is Dorothy Day. She was born before the turn of the century and has lived her adult life among the wounded and poor of the earth. She's been called the most influential lay person in the history of American Catholicism, as much a symbol of Catholicism in the United States as any single individual. Such tributes annoy her, because although she has obeyed a magnificent call to help transfigure this stricken world, Dorothy Day considers herself merely a pilgrim on a lonely spiritual adventure. A pilgrim and a subversive. At 75, Dorothy Day is still a rebel. She was born into an Episcopal home, a nominal one at that. As a young woman, she ruthlessly cut religion out of her life altogether, flirting for a while with agnosticism, socialism, and Marxism as she set out to be a journalist. Then two events occurred that were forever to change Dorothy Day's life. She had a child, which in some way never fully explained led to her conversion to Catholicism, and she met a remarkable, eccentric, peripatetic visionary named Peter Morin. Together they would become the founders of the Catholic worker movement, perhaps the most important social movement within the church in America in this century. The strength of the movement grew from the Catholic Worker, a monthly paper, from the practice of voluntary poverty, and from service to the poor with no strings attached, and from dedication with great force and clarity to the essentials of the Christian faith. Since 1933, disciples of the movement have put out their paper, given coffee, bread, soup, and a place to rest to thousands of bereft human beings. They fought for the rights of workers and an end to racial prejudice, and they've called within the church for a more personal liturgy. We can, in this half hour, do justice to the whole scope of the Catholic worker movement. We can simply report something of what we felt in meeting Dorothy Day and her friends. For 40 years, their work is centered here on the Bowery in the midst of human suffering.
The great city of New York, just a short month ago, came into our door on First Street with a poor little woman who was covered with lice from head to foot from sleeping out and filth and broken down buildings, with some loathsome sores, and to be very indelicate, a prolapsed rectum, covered with filth of excrement, urine, and head lice and body lice, and came and brought her to us, the police, the Brooklyn police. This is how extreme we can get. This happens over and over again in the history of the Catholic worker. And why not take her to the women's municipal lodging house? They have 45 beds. There was no room. Why not take her to Bellevue Hospital for her physical condition? It's a chronic case. Let's register her in the clinic and she can come back. But she has no place to live, of course. St. Vincent's Hospital, woman being released with tumor on the brain, an operation unsuccessful, although she lived a long time afterward. And no place for her to go. And our small places, I don't know how over the years you can accumulate such a tremendous saga of rescue, but when the city of New York, the greatest, richest city in the world, goes ahead and has to bring in this woman from the streets.
Most of them are good men, I would describe them. Good men who worked hard all their lives. These are the men who did hard construction labor, who worked in a time when there were no Social Security or unions, and they reached the age where they can no longer do hard physical labor, and they've been thrown off and discarded by society. And so they depend upon groups like the Catholic worker for their meals.
All you can do with someone who's down and out or who's just really been messed over is be with them. And we provide certain physical things that people may need around here. And more beyond that, and I think much more important, and I think really in a lot of ways more important even to the men who come in on the soup line than the soup, is just that we're here and we're going to continue to be here, and it's a place where they get called sir instead of get calling, hey you bum, you know. And it's a place where we hope we don't kick people around. It's a place where we hope we're not arbitrary, but we try to treat people with some respect. There's some kind of mutual respect.
So many people have written so many generous comments about you in the last few years that I would think adulation would become a problem for you.
Well, in a way it makes you feel like an awful failure. You feel that somehow you've made some terrible mistakes along the way, you know. But I think it's the failure of the American people who insist upon having a figurehead. And I suppose it's because I'm a woman journalist who writes personally because I was taught to write personally. We started writing newspapers when we were 10 years old in the family. I was taught that a woman had to write sob stuff. And whenever I tried to write serious things, like the revolution in Mexico when I was living down there in 1929, and the closing of the churches and the martyrdom of Catholics and so on, these stories would be rejected, and the stories that would be accepted would be the stories of the wanderings of myself and my 4-year-old daughter around Mexico, a travelogue. And as a matter of fact, the readers of the Commonweal got to like these stories so much that when I didn't write a story for 6 months, one woman said, "Is she dead?" meaning the child, and would demand more stories of this sort. During the crisis of the 30s, when anti-Semitism was beginning to bloom, you might say, in Brooklyn, where somewhere over on Borough Hall they had meetings where the swastika was much in evidence, and there was a great deal of anti-Semitism, and meetings were held in halls with bands and people speaking about Hitler's great work of overcoming communism, Jews being synonymous with communism. We would go over there with a paper and distribute it and have it torn up and thrown in our faces. And when I wrote stories about that, they were rejected, and I would get sweet, polite letters from the editor saying, "Dear Dorothy, why don't you keep to your delightful informal essay style and leave these issues to greater minds," I suppose. But I think things have changed to a certain extent so that you can write about profound issues like the injustice, the suffering of the needy and the groaning of the poor.
Are you sympathetic to any extent with what women are trying to do today in reaching for their rights and for their individuality?
Yes, I think it's in a great many areas it's very necessary, but not in the question. I would say local politics, if I stayed long enough in one place, instead of traveling around between New York and Tivoli and visiting various groups of the Catholic workers throughout the country, I would be more interested in local politics. And I think that's very necessary. I think that when it comes down to it, I think Martin Buber had the right idea when he said the state should be a community of communities. I don't think you can legislate the rights of individuals. I think that has to spring out of a man's realization that we are of what St. Paul called the mystical body of Christ, that we're all members one of another.
Stanley Vishnevsky was there in the beginning, a young activist taking time to sell the Catholic worker on the street for a penny. He remains Dorothy Day's friend and colleague.
I think that the Catholic worker has had a terrific influence on the thinking of this country in sort of an indirect way. Because I'll never forget that during the Great Depression, when John Kennedy was the late President of the United States, came down to visit us. He was very young. In fact, he was going to college then. And he came down with his brother Joe Kennedy. They spent an afternoon with us looking around the place, and I remember distinctly how bewildered he was by the sight of the poverty and the misery of the place. And then Dorothy came in, and she talked to him, and then Dorothy says, "Come and have supper with us." And Kennedy looked at her a little and startled and says, "No, well, come out and have dinner with us instead." So Dorothy and Joe and John Kennedy. We went out to the little restaurant around the corner. We had a wonderful conversation.
And you think that the paper and the people who've been involved in the movement, Dorothy, have touched people like that?
I think that the influence of that day at the Catholic Worker, when he saw another side of life for him, I believe Kennedy realized that poverty, because he knew from the Catholic Worker what poverty really was. And I have a feeling that the Catholic Worker, in a way, was the seed that planted the idea of the poverty program, that brought the idea of the poor to the attention of people. But the poor are isolated in pockets here and there and all around us, and we don't see them.
Let me ask you about what appears to some to be something of an irony in the relationship between the Catholic worker movement, yourself, and the church. You fought racism all of your life. You fought the war. You fought poverty. And yet there are within the church, as well as in other parts of society, resistance now to integration in middle-class neighborhoods, hawkish support for the war from these people, and some resistance to doing something about the poor. What about these contradictions?
Some resistance, plenty of resistance. You look at these estates up and down the Hudson there, owned by the church and various orders, and you think to yourself, it's a crime, crying to heaven for vengeance. And I think this kind of a vengeance is going on now. They're emptying, they don't have the postulants to come. The buildings stand empty, they're selling them. This great big Jesuit seminary down there is now a cooking school. The Christian Brothers are leasing their property to the city. I think to myself, there needs to be great liberators come to liberate it from its investments. And I think that's going to be a very difficult thing. It's a very difficult thing for people themselves to liberate themselves from the whole concept of interest on money. And we have to have, dealing with insurance companies, we have to go ahead and deal with interest on mortgages and so on and so forth, because you can't buy a piece of property without having a mortgage. So we're all involved in this whole money scheme, just as the church is.
Well, do you see these as the main, as the chief priorities?
It's one of the biggest problems. Chesterton says that interest and war were the two great problems of the day. Two of the greatest problems of the day. And when the church puts this money out, money lending at interest, and gets itself involved with war industries, and what isn't involved? Anybody who owns any kind of investments, if you put your money in the bank puts it out. If you put it in mutual funds, they put it out. So that in a way we're all guilty, every single one of us. And that's why I say that when we're dealing with these issues and writing about this, we're not writing about this from any height of virtue. It's just something that we as an American people are involved in. And I think that when Cardinal Spellman said, "My country, right or wrong," I thought to myself, yes, it's true. It is our country, and every single one of us are involved in the right and the wrong. And he meant it in one way, perhaps, but at the same time, who can judge how he meant it?
You once wrote that if the Chancery ordered you to stop publishing the Catholic Worker tomorrow, you would. Isn't that accepting someone else's definition of your freedom?
When I said I would obey Cardinal Spellman, there's many times of great weariness in work of this kind. And you would think to yourself, well, how pleasant it would be if I could just drop all responsibilities and all authority. The authority which comes, from the fact that you've taken it upon yourself to do something. You just have to do it. And somebody's saying, stop. And my conscience, I think, looking around me and seeing the tremendous growth of the Catholic worker around the country in all these small ways, these very small ways, made me realize that I could immediately obey the Cardinal, and nothing could stop the Catholic worker. And I must say that I first became a Catholic because I felt that the Catholic Church was the church of the poor, and I still think it's the church of the poor. I think it's the church of all the immigrant populations that came over or were brought over for the prosperous Puritan, money-making developers of this country, ravishers of it, you might say. the very words used in connection with them: guineas, dagos, wops, mix. Irish weren't allowed to own property in Massachusetts. But the church itself, as I say, is still misunderstood in many, many ways. The freedom in the church is something which nobody understands. I believe in miracles, of course. I believe that perhaps someday there may be mutinies large enough to bring an end to war. Who knows what will happen? When my mother died, she said to me, she said, "Dorothy, don't pray that I live." She said, "I've been through 2 world wars, the San Francisco earthquake and the Florida hurricane, and I really feel that I've had enough." In other words, she lived through them and endured them, and she was a woman of a happy disposition. But she felt that her life was full and that she was ready to go, and she had this beautiful acceptance. But we're living in these times of a time of tremendous failure.
Of what?
Of man's sense of responsibility for what he is doing. He relinquishes it to the state. He's not obedient to his own, the promptings of conscience. We were talking about obedience before and the various meanings of it. It's a very important word. And it seems to me that if the Catholic worker arouses the conscience by a constant portrayal of man's needs, the constant failure of government, the constant failure of any but this taking upon oneself, even though it doesn't bring the satisfaction of any immediate accomplishment. I suppose everybody thinks whatever they do is just a drop in the bucket, but this quotation from William James that one of our readers sent to us, we've reprinted it on cards and have sent it out certainly to everyone who writes to us. "I am done with great things and big things, great institutions and big success, and I am for those tiny, invisible, molecular moral forces that work from individual to individual, creeping through the crannies of the world like so many rootlets, or like the capillary oozing of water, yet which, if you give them time, will rend the hardest monuments of man's pride."
Dorothy Day remains an enigma, a radical and yet an adherent, a journalist who is also an activist, a believer and still a rebel. And so this small, unashamed tribute has to end with the one mystery which has long attended people like Dorothy Day, that God has always chosen the foolish things of this world to confound the wise. I'm Bill Moyers.